Hi, I'm Don Anderson. I'm one of the Healdsburg Museum docents. Healdsburg has been truly blessed by having immigrants come and settle here from around the world, and no group has had a greater impact on our community than those who came here from Italy between 1880 and 1920. During that 40-year period, 16 million Italians left their homeland, with a majority coming to the United States. Most of the others headed towards either Western Europe or South America. The root cause of so many people leaving was the unification of Italy, where 8 independent countries in the Italian peninsula came together and formed the new Kingdom of Italy under a new king and a new flag. These 8 states ranged from the city-state of Lucca, not much larger than today's city of Lucca, to the Kingdom of Lombardy that was totally under the control of another country, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And in the middle, we have the Papal States in purple, which was controlled by the Vatican. You might also notice the red arrow in the upper left-hand corner points to the little village of Asti, which we'll be talking about a little while later in this presentation. The unification of Italy brought about a collapse of the feudal system, which had prevented upward mobility, but at the same time at least provided stability and for the working classes and allowed people to at least put food on the table. In the new situation, there was a great deal of poverty and hunger. We know of one Sonoma County family, when asked why they left Italy, they said, "We were tired of eating chestnuts 3 times a day." Italy had a real lack of industrialization and infrastructure that was being enjoyed by Western Europe and the United States during the Industrial Revolution. The new country had high taxes. There was a lot of corruption and exploitation of the average person, which then brought about political instability and quite a bit of disillusionment. There was a lack of loyalty to the new country. And for younger men, there was a real fear of being drafted by a new nation they didn't really understand. Why did a majority of the Italians who fled their homeland around the turn of the century choose to come to the United States? Well, in a single word, jobs. Whether it was factory work in the cities of the Midwest or the East Coast, or agricultural work in the South or the West, there was always work available. People could once again afford to put food on their table and support their families. Birds of passage is an expression that was used referring to immigrants who came to the U.S. intending on only staying a short amount of time to earn money and return home with their savings. Now, in actuality, many of those who intended to stay temporarily did end up setting down roots and staying in the United States. There are many Italian ghettos throughout the U.S. that were easy for people to assimilate in and get a foothold while they figured out their next steps. Wikipedia lists over 60 Little Italies around the United States. That includes North Beach in San Francisco, where my wife's great-grandmother stayed her entire adult life without ever having to learn a word of English. She did, however, believe it was very important for her children to learn English. Healdsburg had its own Little Italy. It was called the Puginosa District, and it was down around where Healdsburger Restaurant now stands. Chain migration is where a person would follow a family member who had previously migrated to the United States, usually an older sibling. And finally, well, steerage class travel in the 19th century was not a pleasant experience at all, relative to a generation or two earlier with sailing ships. Transatlantic travel had become more convenient, cheaper, and safer and much more reliable. Some people once on the East Coast had made the additional journey either around the Horn or through Panama to come to California. California, because of the previous Spanish influence in California, the Catholic Church was very strong. And while Catholicism was often looked down upon in the East Coast and Midwest, the church here was strong and really provided a safe haven for Italians coming to California. Mass was held in Latin, just as it had been at home. Sonoma County was often known as Emeritus Tuscany. If you look at the two photos below, one was of our own Dry Creek Valley, and the other was taken in Tuscany. And it's really hard to tell which picture is which. And it wasn't just that the areas looked the same, but they had similar climates. And so a person with a farming background could grow the same crops that they'd been growing back home in Italy. And finally, the Chinese Exclusion Act, as horrific as it was, did open up a lot of jobs for Italians and other immigrants, European immigrants coming to the U.S. Now, Italians did face a considerable amount of discrimination in the late 1800s and early 1900s. William Jennings Bryan was a prominent politician, congressman, secretary of state, presidential candidate, and he said, quote, "As a class, the Italian immigrants to the United States are not desirable. Of all the nations in Europe, they are the worst. They're ignorant, and they have little or no knowledge of the spirit of our institutions. Life with them is cheap and among the worst, and but a step from the bravo and bandit." Shortly thereafter, the San Francisco Chronicle said Southern Italians are, quote, "murderous, undesirable immigrants." So it's because of these prejudices that in 1920, the U.S. Congress passed and the President signed a series of anti-immigration laws that specifically targeted Italians and made it very difficult for Italians to continue to migrate to the United States. So we talked at the beginning of this talk about the great surge of Italians coming here between 1880 and 1920. The start of that, 1880, coincided with the unification of Italy, and the end, 1920, coincided with the anti-immigration laws. The port of call for most immigrants coming to California was San Francisco. We talked earlier about Little Italy. They had a place that they could land and assimilate easy and figure out their life. One son of Italian immigrants was A.P. Giannini, and he started in North Beach, of course, the Bank of Italy. And he had a different approach to banking than most banks did, which targeted large businesses and wealthy individuals and really had no interest in serving what some would have considered the lower classes. Mr. Giannini pursued specifically immigrants, Italian immigrants, and people with very little money. He wanted small deposits, and he was very happy putting out small loans to people to maybe buy their first home or start a business. And with that approach, by the time Mr. Giannini passed away 40 years later, the Bank of Italy, which had since changed its name to Bank of America, had grown to be the largest bank in the United States in terms of total deposits. And along the way, he had helped many, many immigrant families really get their financial foothold. Another Italian immigrant in the early 1900s was Andrea Sabarbaro. And he had seen an Italian savings and loan that had helped a lot of Italian immigrants build their first homes in the Bay Area and thought he could apply some of those same principles to an agricultural enterprise. He had traveled the state by train because he needed to be near a train track and found an old sheep farm just north of Healdsburg a ways that really reminded him of home. And he named his future town Asti, like we talked about earlier on, because where he came from looked just like northern Sonoma County. And he started what some thought was a utopian community to a lot of Italians straight off the boat in San Francisco and brought them up to his new town with the hopes of growing grapes and making wine. And his original philosophy that this would be a worker-owned enterprise didn't really pan out. uh, Recent immigrants expected to work hard. They wanted to work hard, but they didn't understand the concept of having a little bit of their paycheck withheld uh, so they could earn equity in their organization. So Mr. Sabarboro got some additional investors and ran a more traditional type of venture. And he really had a nice town there. This church, Our Lady of Mount Carmel Chapel, was right in the middle of the vineyards, and it looked just like a giant wine cask. He also had a church. They also had dairies, another type of food production, and many, many families grew up in the Asti area. And some stayed a short while with the Italian Swiss colony, and some stayed quite a bit longer. Um, the Italian Swiss colony survived Prohibition by producing sacramental wine, and they got through the Depression. And by the time the World War II was over, they kind of restructured and started producing mass market wines for the average person. In the 1950s and 60s, the Italian Swiss colony ran frequent television commercials, which were voiced by Jim Backus. And they had a great jingle, and we've got links in our museum YouTube channel, so please click below and enjoy watching it. And this is the real little old winemaker. His name was Joe Frediani. He was a Italian immigrant, lifelong Sonoma County native, and he created this persona of the little old winemaker, and which was on the TV commercials. And because of what Joe and his colleagues did, the Italian Swiss colony by the 1960s was the #2 visitor destination in California, second only to Disneyland. This is a gentleman named Eduardo Passalacqua, who is a truck farmer. That was a common term back in the around the turn of the century for small farmers who had owned or leased an acre or a few acres of land and were able to produce enough fruits and vegetables to take their wares into town on the back of their truck, or in this case, a wagon, and they could earn enough money to support their family. Eduardo's father, Francisco, had come from Genoa a few years earlier, and Francisco never had a day's education in his life. He'd worked full time in the fields starting at age 6. At age 13, he had saved up enough money to buy himself his first pair of shoes. And at age 18, he was drafted by the army of the new Kingdom of Italy. So he borrowed some money from a friend, and the day before he was scheduled to report to duty, he hopped on a boat and headed off towards the U.S. Eventually made his way to Healdsburg and worked as a farmer and grew his business, bought more and more land. And by the time he turned 60 years old, 40 years later, he had built for himself and his family was possibly the grandest home in Healdsburg, this beautiful neoclassical Italianate home that is now up on Fifth Street that the family still maintains and keeps care of. The Passalacqua Vineyards at the bottom of this screen are in the back of Dry Creek Valley and are quite beautiful. And many of Francisco's descendants have worked in the legal field, including at least one local judge. Letizia Raffinelli was born in Tuscany in a wine producing family, which was a business she understood and loved. However, unfortunately, in her family and in her community, women did not work in the wine business. Women raised families. So reluctantly, she left home and followed a brother who a year earlier had migrated to San Francisco. Remember earlier we talked about chain migration? Once in San Francisco, she met Alberto, they fell in love, married, and moved to Healdsburg, where they bought a few acres of land. That is where Healdsburg High School stands today. And they started a small farm, which they were very successful at. And they built their family home themselves, and took them 2 years to build the home. And their two suppliers of building materials were Healdsburg Lumber Company and Garrett's Hardware, both of whom did not expect to be paid for their supplies until after the crops came in. Both these businesses understood that if they're going to serve the farming community in Healdsburg, that's kind of the way it worked. Now, this business model must have been successful because both Garrett's and Healdsburg Lumber are thriving today. Once Prohibition came along, the Raffinellis realized they could make extra money by producing alcohol. And they first made brandy, and Alberto took Letizia's old laundry washing bin, which she had used to wash the family's laundry, and converted it into a still. And that still is still in the family today, and it's photographed here on the right. While the Raffinellis produced alcohol to earn a little extra money, many families in Healdsburg continue to make alcohol as a means of survival, a way to earn money to put food on their table. This slide shows some clippings from local newspapers showing that the federal agents had blown up stills, had jailed local farmers for violating prohibition laws. The Sonoma County Sheriff had a two-story jail. Downstairs, the regular inmates stayed. Upstairs was for those who'd violated prohibition laws. And these men all hung out together and played cards. Their wives brought homemade meals for them, and they had a good old time. And when they were released, they went right back home and rebuilt their operations out of necessity. Now, it's well known that the Raffinellis were able to produce wine during Prohibition because the federal agents looked the other way at their bootlegging because they liked the Raffinellis wine better than anybody else's, which is rather ironic if you think about it. And I asked the family patriarch, Dave Raffinelli, about this, and he smiled and said, I've been hearing that story my whole life. I don't think it's true. I don't believe that the federal agents looked the other way at my grandparents' bootlegging because they liked their wine. I believe they looked the other way at my grandparents' bootlegging because they liked my grandmother's biscotti. And every time that she'd hear they're in the area, she'd put a fresh batch in the oven. So whether it was the wine or the biscotti, we'll never really know. But it is probably fair to say that the prohibition laws were not evenly enforced. The Raffinelli family today has a beautiful farm up on the side of the Dry Creek Valley and a very successful wine label. But if we think back about Letizia, who had to leave her native Tuscany because girls weren't allowed to work in the wine business, she'd probably be thrilled to know now that the successful family business is run by her great granddaughter. Billy Ferrari was drafted by the Kingdom of Italy's army, and in the army, he learned how to be a mechanic. Once he was discharged, he headed to the U.S., made his way to the Italian Swiss colony, where for the first 3 years here, he worked with the intention of learning everything he could about the wine industry. Once he'd spent a few years learning about the wine industry, he went to work for the Healdsburg machine shop, right on Healdsburg Avenue. This building now houses an antique store. And a belly is at the second from the left at the drill press. And after a few years here, a belly and two of his colleagues bought the business from their boss and went to really concentrate on building equipment for the wine industry. This is a 1937 patent application for a grape crusher that's known as the Healdsburg crusher. And this is a drawing that a belly made, and they would sell these up and down California. We have a couple of friends of the museum, Russell and BJ Green, who back around the turn of this century, they were driving in a very remote part of southern France and saw a small winery up on a hill and went to call on it. And the winemaker said, "Well, where are you from?" And they said, "California." He said, "Yeah, but where?" And they said, "Northern California." And he said, "Yeah, but where?" And they said, "Well, you've never heard of it. We're from a small town called Healdsburg." And he said, "Come with me." And he took him out back, and there was a 1940s era Healdsburg crusher pounding away, and engraved in the machine was manufactured Healdsburg, USA. And this is really quite a tribute to Abelli and the quality of his work, that this machine was still working 60 to 70 years later and had made it halfway around the world to one of the most prominent winemaking regions in the world. So that's quite an effect that he had had. Several Italian families, such as the Granucci's, had taken savings they earned working in the fields and started grocery stores. And if you go back to the 30s and 40s, there were several Italian groceries in Healdsburg. And finally, we talked about how hardworking and industrious Italian immigrants were in Sonoma County and in Healdsburg, but they also like to have fun and relax as well. Bocce ball was something they brought with them. This is a group of gentlemen in the 1940s in Healdsburg's municipal bocce ball court, which still stands today in Recreation Park. And this was a time for the gentlemen to get together and relax and spend a little time. So thank you very much for listening.